To talk more about the State of the Union, I'm joined now by RT correspondent Meghan Lopez and RT producer Katie Fischer. Welcome, ladies. So, Meghan, hopefully, I know you were there covering this. Hopefully, you didn't face the wrath of Grimm. What were some of the highlights for you?
Well, the highlight for me, as you just mentioned, was not being threatened. But there are a lot of other highlights. Obviously, this was a much more moderate speech that President Obama delivered than any of the State of the Unions that we've seen in this past. That's barring the executive action that he threatened. In terms of his some of the highlights, he promised the same things that he has in years past. He promised once again that he wants Guantanamo Bay closed for good and the detainees transferred out of it. He wanted to raise minimum wage. He wants to reform the tax code, reform voting rights in America. And really, he kind of got into very briefly immigration and gun control. And also he defended the health care. Obviously, he was playing defense in the wake of the NSA reform scandal and in the wake of the Obamacare's failed rollout. So he was really on the defense in the State of the Union as never before.
On the defense, because as we've seen, he's had a hard time getting a lot of these things done. Want to take a look at the approval ratings, the recent ratings for our elected leaders going into this. Take a look at Congress first. Their disapproval rating is at 81.6%. So their approval rating very low, just over 12% there. And looking at the president's ratings, his disapproval rating is at 49%. His approval rating only at 43%. So that 43% is near the lowest that we've seen in his presidency. Of course, Katie, frustration over his ability to get things done. Last night he announced executive orders. Meghan touched upon it briefly there. Executive orders that he is going to take. How is the climate in Washington? We see how low these approval ratings are led up to. Is this, I guess, a last resort for him, trying to get anything done, something?
It really is. I mean, he is viewing his lowest approval ratings ever. Congress not doing so hot either, worse, in fact. And so he's trying to get something done. And to do so, he feels he has to resort to these executive powers, trying to pass legislation. You heard in the speech that, you know, when there is progress, we're in places where there is progress being made in the House, in immigration, etc. There was a lot more wheeze being heard. But when, you know, you start hearing things that he can't get done, he was calling for these executive orders. I mean, this is the least productive Congress since 1947. But as we spoke with some of these Congress people, we saw that, you know, some of these Democrats are okay with these executive orders, but many Congress people see that, wait a second, you're stepping into the separation of powers issue. Maybe you need to take a step back. This is our job. They're feeling a bit jealous, so.
Right. And you know, these executive orders, some see it as a last resort. Some see it as taking it too far. Meghan, you had mentioned earlier some of these promises that he made. One of them is closing Gitmo. That's a promise that many see as a promise not fulfilled. And I think when you hear these speeches, it kind of raises these questions of how much of it is rhetoric, how much of it is just talk, and how much is this going to be reality?
Well, the State of the Union historically has been more or less a wish list that the president sets out each year. One thing that is different with this State of the Union address versus other ones is this one really looked back more on the accomplishments and kind of was more of a pat on the back versus looking forward. The other thing that was really different about this one is it did tone down some of that rhetoric, making it, again, one of the more moderate speeches that we've seen come out of him in recent history. In terms of rhetoric versus actual accomplishments, it's very hard to determine right now how any of this is going to be done. Obviously, it's a very big list. Just moving the federal minimum wage up will be a huge battle, both in local governments as well as federally. Yes, he can sign executive orders, but really, you know, it's going to take a lot of smaller battles and then congressional battles. In terms of immigration, that's something that almost everybody agrees needs to happen, but still it's not happening. You know, so there's a lot of different issues that should, yes, absolutely be on the agenda and absolutely be done, but we just don't know right now anyway how Congress is going to react, especially considering the fact that we are about to enter a 2014 midterm election where all of the seats could be jumbled. The Senate could go swing back to the Republicans if they get 8 more seats, and everything could change. And just to kind of go back and look over the night, I did put a piece together to kind of really highlight some of the things that he did talk about, some of the things he didn't talk about, and some of the things that we're hoping to see moving forward. 6 years ago, President Obama's message to Congress and the nation was one of hope and change.
Yes, we can to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can heal this nation.
A term and a half later, that message has transformed to this.
Let's make this a year of action.
A year of action after arguably one of the least productive years in congressional history. The president's speech comes during a time when the White House and National Security Agency are on the defense. The president's own approval ratings have slipped to 43%. Piggybacking off a recent NSA surveillance reform speech, the president once again promised change, but this time for a scandal he helped perpetuate.
Working with this Congress, I will reform our surveillance programs because the vital work of our intelligence community depends on public confidence here and abroad that privacy of ordinary people is not being violated.
They are reforms Congress is largely on board with.
I think the NSA needs to be reformed, and I think Congress is of that opinion. I don't think that's a particularly partisan issue, and we want to make sure that the privacy of the American people is protected, consistent with making sure that we overcome any threat we have from terrorists, and I think we can achieve both goals at the same time.
We've got to make sure that as technology changes, we also make sure that our values remain consistent.
But how many of those pledges actually go into effect in America's most secretive operations is still questionable at this point. Another issue largely glazed over, drones. Their only mention:
America must move off a permanent war footing. That's why I've imposed prudent limits on the use of drones. For we will not be safer if people abroad believe we strike within their countries without regard for the consequence.
Consequences like civilian casualties. According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, at least 2,400 people were killed by strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia in the past 5 years. Hundreds of them were believed to be civilians, including children. Consequences like international retribution. Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has voiced strong condemnation against the drone program and demanded for its end. The issue of domestic drones was not addressed despite the fact that both the UAV industry and the number of drone permits issued are skyrocketing. In terms of foreign policy, the president mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria in brief, but largely touted U.S. accomplishments instead of laying out a path moving forward. Continuing with his pledge to end American aggressions abroad, he appealed to Congress to rethink relations with Iran.
Let me be clear. If this Congress sends me a new sanctions bill now that threatens to derail these talks, I will veto it. For the sake of our national security, we must give diplomacy a chance to succeed.
The issue of loosening sanctions hit a sore spot for many members of Congress.
The Congress is deeply concerned that Iran may be building a nuclear weapon.
We have to deal with the threat in Iran as it relates to the possibility of them acquiring a nuclear weapon. No decent person in the Congress, in the country, or across the world thinks that it's a good idea for Iran to acquire nuclear capability.
Every year, promises are made, and every year, more than a few of them are broken. President Obama spent the majority of the speech focusing on domestic economic issues like tax reform and raising the minimum wage. In 2013, President Obama promised Medicare reform, tax reform, and a budget. Medicare reform has yet to happen, tax reform is nowhere closer to coming up for debate, and the recent hack on Target proves that America's cybersecurity is more vulnerable than ever. Congress did pass a budget, but only after a 3-week government shutdown. Despite the president's push to tie the minimum wage to the cost of living in his 2013 speech, not even the $10.10 proposal the president offered for federal employees this year meets that mark. This year, President Obama made even more promises during his State of the Union address. But Congress has the ultimate say in how much of that wish list really gets done. And with midterm elections right around the corner, it's now a race against time to see how many of those pledges will really be fulfilled before campaign season kicks into gear. In Washington, Meghan Lopez, RT.